Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Terry Smith. I am the Emeritus Board Member of Commonwealth North, and welcome everybody to our first real no holds bars, no mask meeting and Commonwealth North, and just great to see all you and also be welcomed to our great day out there with the spring weather. So thank you for joining us today, and wanted to just kind of give you just a general overview. Commonwealth North serves as a nonpartisan public forum to illuminate Alaska's most critical issues. Through study groups and informational programs, Commonwealth North provides opportunities for Alaskans to learn about issues and engage with leaders. In doing so, Commonwealth North seeks to grow civil discourse and marketplace of ideas to share important topics and educate the population on getting ahead and on the learning curve. Today, we are convened here in Anchorage, the homeland of the Dena'ina Athabascan people. We are joined by Alaskans online, and hopefully this program and its recording will reach out across Alaska, the homeland of 229 federally recognized tribes spanning the rich diversity of Alaska's First People. While we've had a handful of in-person or hybrid events over the last 2 years, we hope this is the beginning of a return to a consistent in-person meeting schedule for our monthly programs. Tell your friends, better yet, bring your friends along. Today, we are assisted by our favorite invertebrate volunteer registrar, Carol Anderson. Please, let's thank Carol for her welcome smile and efficiency and consistency. You're always there. We so appreciate your help day in, day out. And we welcome those of you that are joining online. We can see you here in the room on the screen, and you should be able to see us on your monitors. Our executive director, Juanetta Ayers, is online with you to assist. Please let her know if you have any sound or connectivity issues. It is great to have you with us. I need to learn sign language. I love that. Big into sign language now. All the movies is phenomenal. So so thank you. For both our guests online and here in person, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the planned presentations. Please submit your questions through the Q&A window if you are online. And if you're here in the room, please use the note cards at your tables to write down your questions for the panel. We'll collect those questions and our moderator will pose them to the panel. Typically, you'll find the icon for that item on the menu at the bottom of your screen if you're online. Before I introduce our guests, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Alaska Communications, ConocoPhillips of Alaska, and Northrim Bank for their support and underwriting. Commonwealth North could not host its programs and keep its operations humming over the past year and continuing into 22 without you. We appreciate your support. It has been vital to our programs this year and the continuity of our organization. I extend my thanks to the Commonwealth North members who are with us today. We're grateful for your participation in programs and study groups, as well as your commitment to citizen engagement in public policy. For those of you who are not members, we always want to take a moment to thank you and invite you to join Commonwealth North. We provided membership information on your tables here in the room, and Juanetta will post a link for those of you online. Please consider joining us as we explore and illuminate the issues that are shaping our state. Commonwealth North has hosted a number of sessions on telecommunications, and more recently, the need for and the expansion of broadband services. In fact, one could argue that telecommunications rivals the airplane in its impact, making it possible to reach across our expansive state, connect Alaskans, connect us to the rest of the world, and make possible our greatest dreams and ideas for our state. Today, with a new state broadband plan in place, and a veritable deluge of federal funding poised to wash up on our shores, the broadband landscape will be dramatically transformed in the coming years. To introduce our panel of speakers and moderate your questions, we quite literally went to the guy who wrote the book. Our guest moderator today is Dr. Alex Hills. Alex came to Alaska 52 years ago to help build rural Alaska's first modern telecommunication system. After living and working in Alaskan villages for most of a decade, he was tapped by Governor Jay Hammond to be the Deputy Commissioner of Administration and Alaska's first Chief Telecommunications official. Dr. Hills is now Distinguished Service Professor of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, where he led the team that built the world's first Wi-Fi network. But he is still in Alaska. Alex and his wife Meg live right up the road in Palmer. Alex, I'm turning this over to you and your very capable hands. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcoming Alex Hill.
Thanks, Terry. It certainly is an honor for me to moderate the panel that we have today. I've been concerned for many years about the situation with broadband in rural Alaska. In fact, I began to advocate for that about 20 years ago. But in his introduction, Terry mentioned my own work in rural Alaska, where we once brought what we then called modern telecom service to the villages. Modern telecom service in the 1970s and 1980s was a radio, a TV set, and a phone. But then the internet happened and everything changed. And that was when I began to advocate for better broadband service in the villages. But in the past 2 years, the pandemic has really made the broadband gap painfully obvious. But now we have a new Federal Infrastructure Act that's given us a great opportunity to help catch up. There can be a big leap forward. And so our program today is not about any particular project, company, organization, or technology, although we may have a program on that later. Today we'll be talking about the process that's needed for Alaska to seize the moment, to effectively use the new federal money that will soon be available. Our speakers are Commissioner Julie Sande, Alaska's Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development, Lisa Von Bargen, Senior Project Manager in the same department, and Christine O'Connor, who was a member of Governor Dunleavy's Broadband Task Force, a key member I might mention. For clarity, we've agreed to present things in chronological order, covering these main topics. First, the recommendations of the Governor's Broadband Task Force. Second, the broadband provisions of the Federal Act. Technically, it's called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, inside the Beltway IIJA. And there's a broadband component to that. And third, we'll hear about the creation of the state's new broadband office, and that broadband office is required to be created by the federal legislation. As you've heard, there are cards on the table, on your tables for Q&A, and folks online will be able to submit questions that way. It's fine to submit those questions during the presentations, but we'll do the Q&A after all the speakers have presented. So our first speaker, and if we're ready, our first speaker is Commissioner Julie Sande of the Alaska Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development. Commissioner Sande grew up in the remote logging camps of Southeast Alaska and later spent many years involved in healthcare. She worked in the Ketchikan Pioneer Home, where she rose to be its director. Commissioner Sande says that she was inspired there by the pioneers and elders that she knew and worked with. She's also a business owner whose companies provide services across a wide range of industries. Commissioner Sande.
Good afternoon. I'm going to just check my volume. You guys can hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate having an opportunity to come and introduce myself as the brand new commissioner for the Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development. It's an incredible team, and they cover a wide range of services across a spectrum that's almost hard to get your head wrapped around sometimes. We have 6 divisions in the department and then 8 corporate agencies. So between our administrative services, licensing, banking and securities, we have folks out in the regional, the GCRA group, and then we've got our investment team. In addition to that, we have the corporate agencies like ADA and Alaska Energy Authority. We have the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, the Railroad, So we've got a wide group spanning across many industries and touching many lives in Alaska. So for me, and I appreciate the introduction very much, I grew up out in rural Alaska and loved being able to be raised in a logging camp. When you were talking about radios earlier, I was thinking, you know, our version out at camp was a ham radio. We didn't even have electricity most of the time, unless we were on the generator. So it's a different way to grow up, but it gave me a great appreciation for the challenges folks have out in rural Alaska, but also, you know, the real benefits that come with living that kind of a lifestyle. So I, you know, like you said, I grew up out there, but and I have businesses in Ketchikan, but we provide services throughout the region. And that provided me both at the Pioneer Home, the public sector piece of it, and then of course the private sector piece is very different. Some things are the same, but lots of things are really different in terms of, you know, the private sector really has an immediacy of challenges, especially right now with workforce development. And even though in the state agency we can have some of those same challenges, they can be played out a little differently in terms of just how those things are handled. So that's my background, but I was also on the Alaska Industrial Development Export Authority and the Alaska Energy Authority for a few years. I really appreciate that experience because it really gave me a much better sense of the large infrastructure projects for the state. And of course, you know, some really great opportunities with creating affordable energy for Alaskans. So with that said, when I started, I was quickly trying to get the lay of the land. It's like drinking from a fire hose a bit in terms of all the things that I'm learning within the department, but then also just establishing priorities. When we look at economic development, you know, we've got some real foundational pieces to our economy in Alaska that we're all familiar with. Oil and gas, of course, is a huge one, but you know, we've got between tourism, fishing, and timber back in the day, you know, we have a lot of really great opportunities in Alaska, and those foundational pieces of our economy are huge. But we're also really looking towards emerging pieces of the economy, and that's going to be one of the tasks that I have in front of me. And when I was looking at that, it became really clear in a hurry that we call it the IJA, or the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, which I'm happy to say I haven't read yet. I've heard it's about 1,300 pages. But the last time I tried to read a federal bill, it was the Healthcare Act, and that one was about 2,500 pages. So if I can steer clear of actually reading the bill, I'd like to. But for me, when I think about that money and the infrastructure funds that are coming to Alaska and coming quickly, and how do we mobilize, how do we prepare for, and how do we get organized in terms of our priorities, it became really clear that a natural fit for our department would be to stand up the Alaska Office of Broadband. So that's our plan, and our role in that is really, you know, from my perspective, other than, you know, the piece that's like, you know, speaks to my heart, which is the rural part of it. You know, I love the idea. I haven't been back out there. We own rural property out where I grew up, but I haven't been back out there since the pandemic. So I don't know for sure how things have changed. I can only speculate based on what the folks I know out there say. But, you know, our reliance on digital technology and all the advancements that's occurred elsewhere, it's a real heartbreak when you think that those same services aren't available or available consistently to the folks out in rural Alaska. You know, for me personally, when I think about the implications both for healthcare and for education, but then also for the economy, you know, when we talk about the challenges of our economy right now, workforce is huge. And so I think about those pockets of, you know, brilliant folks that are out in the rural communities that before haven't been able to contribute in some ways because they don't have access. And broadband could certainly level that playing field. So for me, it's a definite passion project, and I love the idea of that. But also, you know, for the department, what I see our role for standing up the broadband office, it's really going to just be managing that grant administration piece of it, which, thank God the Department of Commerce does so well. And the teams have done really well. Very, limited groups of folks that are deploying. I think right now we've got $1.8 billion through the department that's been deployed through either grants, current grants, or community revenue sharing kinds of things. So what I think we've established is that we can do that well. And we're looking forward to being able to get organized, start and stand that team up. I also just really, before I turn it over to Christine, I really see our role also just helping to communicate information and communicate it well and often. So much of what we're doing right now it's like shifting sands. Things are changing and changing kind of rapidly. We want to make sure that we're navigating that and that the information we have, we're sharing. We want to make sure too that it's transparent. The state has no interest in picking sides or making decisions for communities. We want to make sure that we are just going to be assisting in whatever way we can. And when I think about this sort of organizing it in my head, I realize there's just enough players these days involved to perhaps create some danger in that, that $1 billion that we're going to be talking about that we sort of own today in our minds, there's parallel to that, there's a lot of money coming for the native and the tribal entities. And so that's really, when we talk today from the state side of things, we're keeping that very separate. But since those two things are going to be running parallel to each other, there's lots of opportunities to create redundancies or inefficiencies if we're not clearly communicating what everybody's doing. We want to make sure we stand up a great office that's organized and establishing a really clear criteria for eligibility, and then just really helping where we can. And in all things, I like to be vertically integrated whenever possible. So as I think about the other departments, all the departments within the state are going to be working together and communicating in terms of all the ways in which the infrastructure money is going to be hitting our departments individually. But any opportunities for vertical integration and consolidation of efforts, we want to make sure we do. We recognize this is a once in a lifetime opportunity, at least for us, and we hope that these implications will create positive impacts for generations of Alaskans to come. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine, and after that, Lisa, who's our special projects person, is going to provide more technical information on the office and as we move forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Sande, and thanks for your perspective on the new broadband office within your department. So now we're going to get into the details. And as I said earlier, that's some detail about the Governor's Broadband Task Force results, the federal act that you've already heard a little bit about, and then what's happening within Commissioner Sande's department to implement the state's role in that. So our next speaker will be Christine O'Connor, who was a key member of the Governor's Broadband Task Force. She's also Executive Director of the Alaska Telecom Association. She's worked in strategic and leadership roles since she originally served as the board president of the Nushagak Cooperative, Electric and Telephone, right? Christine's roots in rural Alaska have led her to deep commitment to making broadband available. The tagline here is that Christine is a lifelong Alaskan who returns to Bristol Bay every summer to participate with her family in the greatest sustainable salmon fishery in the world. Christine O'Connor.
Thanks, Alex. It's always fun to see you again and put our heads together. And thanks to Commonwealth North for the invitation. We were just trying to figure it just over 2 years. We had a broadband panel in this room. It must have been, there were green leaves on the trees. So whenever that was, and it's really nice to be back. I have slides for now. I'll just get launched in, and while Winetta launches the slides. Alaska Telecom Association, founded in 1949. We reach all corners of the state. We are a range, can you go to the second slide, please. A range of company structures. A lot of these logos should look very familiar. We have about half of the members are community-owned cooperatives, including Native community-owned and governed cooperatives. We have one employee-owned company there, one very successful municipal entity there, and a couple very large statewide providers. Next slide. Could you put the third one there? Okay, I'll just next slide you. But to move to the subject of the day, the Governor's Task Force on Broadband. As Alex mentioned, I was a part of the task force. I was the technical subgroup chair. Hallie Bissett, of course, was the chair. We had a range of stakeholders, which I felt had a really good representation across not just consumers, but also strong representation from rural areas, healthcare, education, commerce. We met a lot. 32 public meetings, about half of those were 2-hour meetings or more, and extended deliberations before we came out with our final report November 1st, which is posted online there. Next slide, please. To structure our work at the task force, we split into two subgroups, policy and technical. The policy subgroup was chaired by Hallie Bissett, who was also chair of the full task force. And their jobs, we had 8 tasks for the full task force. And their tasks were to come up with a recommendation on a repository of broadband information and expertise, and make recommendations for policies and guidelines on how the state of Alaska should participate in broadband infrastructure. What should that role be? What should it look like? And they came out with some really great recommendations that we'll go into a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. And then there was the technical subgroup, where, again, very diverse. You can see great representation across industries or interest groups, and strong representation, again, from unserved areas, which generally, but not always, are our rural areas. The jobs assigned to the technical subgroup were to identify gaps in broadband coverage, to evaluate all technologies, to identify hurdles. And I really want to highlight a couple members here that were essential to getting our work done. We had at the top there, Stuart Ferguson, Chief Technology Officer of ANTHC. His incredible technical expertise, and then also that perspective of what's needed for telemedicine. And remember, we were meeting last year. We were still really in the pandemic, so could not have been more relevant. And then Steve Noonkesser, Superintendent of Southwest Region School District, but also throughout most of his career, he was the Chief Information Officer. He was the IT guy for the district. So again, really deep technical expertise. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to start highlighting a lot of the recommendations that came out of the task force. There were, I won't hit all 36, but if you look up the report, you can either read the whole thing or go to Appendix D, and they're all listed. First and number one, and I got to say this is my favorite, broadband for all Alaskans. We did not hold back on this. We talked about, well, that's kind of ambitious. And then we said, yeah, that is what is needed. Also, at the time we were developing the report and meeting, we knew the infrastructure bill was being debated and negotiated. And as we got later in our discussions, we knew what the text was. It was public. We just didn't know if or when it would be adopted. So with a great dose of optimism, we really used the potential that we hoped was coming in IJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, to guide us in targeting our report. So we said, if there's this kind of opportunity coming, we can say all Alaskans, and we did. Next slide, please. So turning to our number one job, which was to define the gaps in broadband coverage. We had to define what a gap was before we could identify the gaps. So we said, if you do not have 25.3 megabit service available to you, you're unserved, and therefore you are the number one priority. It doesn't matter if you're in rural Alaska, if you're outside Fairbanks, or even, I don't know, somewhere in Anchorage. If you can't get that speed, you are the number one priority. We also said, and this is paralleling the infrastructure bill, If you can't get 100 by 20 megabit service, which is pretty fast, I don't have that at my house because I don't need it, then you're underserved. You're the next level of priority. We also said latency is important, which that is that kind of delay. If you think back in the day when you'd make a long distance call in Alaska and there was this pause and you would talk over each other, it's the broadband equivalent where there's this delay. Now, in a lot of applications, if you're checking email, that's fine. It totally works. That's actually a picture of my HughesNet dish on my fish camp cabin. It works, but it will not do what we're doing today, real-time streaming. And the Infrastructure Act said you must have latency low enough to do these kind of real-time applications. So and I should back up and say, it's been about 10 years since federal agencies have adopted this metric and kind of imposed it on us. You know, when it was first adopted about 10 years ago by the FCC, we looked at each other and said, basically, this is really ambitious. There's a lot of satellite service in use today in Alaska and has been for decades that this is a hard mark to meet. Nevertheless, it's essential service. So the reality is that is a metric that the FCC, USDA, and now the Infrastructure Act and NTIA have adopted. So we said we need to work with that too. And of course, we recognize the value of this kind of communication. We said data usage should be comparable to urban markets. You know, Anchorage is, for all of us Alaskans that have lived in rural Alaska, Anchorage is kind of your touchstone. If you can get something as good as in Anchorage, you're doing okay. That was kind of our thinking, remembering we had strong rural representation on the task force. Reliability. If you've got a broadband connection, but it's not working most of the time, or enough of the time, or even, we come from a utility background, this concept of 5 nines, meaning a service is available. Yes, I see my utility folks smiling in the background. If it's not available 99.999% of the time, you're kind of missing the mark. So we should have minimal downtime. Next slide, please. So we defined a gap. Where are the gaps? We actually don't totally know. There are not detailed broadband maps yet. Those are being developed right now today. The Infrastructure Act said that this funding would be allocated and priorities would be determined based on a new mapping structure using what they're calling a broadband fabric. And what the fabric does is take the whole United States, put a dot on every broadband serviceable location. So house, building, whatever it is, if you can or should be able to get broadband there, they're going to put a dot. Then they're going to ask every provider in the US, not just ask, they are going to require every provider in the United States to report, do you serve, which dots do you serve, and at what speeds and with what technology. This will create what they're calling the broadband data map, which will define what the priorities are and how much money each state is getting. Some deadlines coming up. The fabric itself with the map with all the dots is supposed to be available June 30th. All of the broadband providers have to report to that map by September 1st. The FCC has to smush it all together very technically. And then they publish it and there's a challenge process. So everyone needs to go look at that map when it's published and say, oh, is there a discrepancy? And then you report back. We probably won't see the final map early next year. I'm thinking sometime about a year from now, spring of 23. That's when we'll see the prioritized locations, number 1 at unserved, 2 at underserved, and how much money we're getting. So Lisa will talk about their planning efforts, which will be very interesting because they won't actually know how much money they have to plan for. Next slide, please. Recommendation, which is kind of an obvious one to anyone following broadband issues, identify where we need middle mile. We have a pretty good sense of that, but as part of the planning process to go forward with infrastructure funding, you really need to identify and nail that down. And as you do that, think and remember standards need to evolve. And this is a requirement of IJA, that any projects funded have to be, and the language even says easily upgradable, because we all know how much broadband were you using 10 years ago? Was it a huge deal beyond email? Wasn't for me. Today, I have to be able to do things like this. In 5 years or 10 years, I don't even know what I will be doing. So next slide, please. And we talked long and hard about this at both the technical subgroup and the full task force. And we said, give preference to fiber middle mile because of its capabilities. The capacity and speeds are almost limitless. You have a fiber strand in, you change the boxes on the end, voila, you can upgrade almost indefinitely. The OpEx is much lower, but please notice that last little phrase, wherever feasible and practical. We are Alaskans. We were sitting in Alaska while we were adopting this recommendation. We know that fiber is not feasible immediately or maybe even in the intermediate term in many places. So we need to use all the technologies. But we also knew that with the funding we expected from IJA, we needed to re-examine where fiber is and is not possible because that whole metric has changed. Places where we would have said, never gonna get fiber there. We need to rethink that in light of this funding. Next slide, please. Speed it up a little. I could go all day, but I will not. We said a balanced investment. There were some suggestions that we should just put all this money in middle mile. Whoa, time out. Some areas need last mile. Some areas, many need middle mile. Some need both. That needs to be done deliberately based on the needs of an area. Next slide, please. We need a fair grant application process. And Lisa will talk about this, and the commissioner talked about it. That's already underway. Developing a transparent, fair process because there's a lot of people and companies that are going to need to participate, and everyone kind of needs to know the rules of the road. We have an exuberant environment right now with 3 major federal agencies just pouring buckets of funding. The Office of Broadband at the state level will be important in coordinating that and getting the best use of it. Next slide, please. Streamline state permitting. A good permit process is the difference between building your project this year and next year or even the next. So good state permitting. Next slide, please. We recognize that affordability is critical. The situation we struggle with in areas of Alaska today is the cost of that infrastructure is so high that the rates to consumers, they're very high. They're unaffordable in some cases. That needs to be considered in all the different methods we can address that. And we have a ton of opportunity coming through the various programs, not just IJA. Next slide, please. Speaking of affordability, the task force recommended establishing a broadband parity adjustment, a parallel to PCE. The mechanics would need to be different because electric and telecom are now very different entities, industries, something to offset consumer costs. Next slide, please. Prioritize local workforce development. We had Commissioner Johnson on the task force, just always reiterating this. We have great training resources at UA, IBEW, but this is a priority. Commissioner Sande mentioned it. Next slide, please. This is, I think, my second favorite recommendation because it really came from people from remote Alaska. They basically said, don't make it worse. The risk with all this funding, if you don't prioritize unserved and then underserved, you could have phenomenal networks where it's easy, relatively easy, and you could leave the hardest places behind. Don't do that. That's what this one means. Next slide, please. Back to the establish a repository of expertise and information. Establish an office of broadband. I will let Lisa speak to that. The task force also said, next slide, please, establish a state broadband advisory board. Essentially, we saw the power of the multi-stakeholders in this task force format, and we thought it would be important for the office to have access to that expertise going forward. Next slide, please. We said strengthen tribal partnerships. One of those parallel buckets and agencies the commissioner mentioned is NTIA. It predates the Infrastructure Act. $1 billion to Native organizations and tribes to build broadband. $2 more billion were put into that program through the infrastructure bill. Those tribal partnerships are going to be very important, and that's a strong role that the office can play in helping to facilitate that. Next slide, please. Maximize federal partnerships. There's our three big agencies that are coming to help with broadband. They're bringing a lot of resources, which is good news. They need to be coordinated, and that will be a job of the office. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to take a couple minutes and skim through the programs that we're in IJA, and Lisa will go into more detail on how the state is preparing for those. This is just a list. It should total 65 billion money being put into the broadband ecosystem. Next slide, please. B, broadband equity access and deployment, 42 billion nationwide. This is the big one and the one people are paying the most attention to. This money goes directly to states, requires states to stand up an office of broadband. And this is where broadband is very different from the rest of the infrastructure bill. Virtually all of the rest of the bill is just, I've heard it called plussing up existing programs, DOT, water and sewer. Not here. This is something brand new. I'm really delighted to have Commissioner Sande so focused on it. Lisa's doing an amazing job. You'll see the same priorities that we adopted in the task force. It requires the state to develop a 5-year plan, and it sets some minimum service parameters for projects, and it requires a broad consultation. So that will all be coming within 6 months, over the next few months. The Affordable Connectivity Program is an offset to consumers' bills, low-income consumers. This was stood up as one of the COVID relief bills. Extra 14 billion went into it. Spread the word. If you're a low-income consumer, $75 off your broadband bill, and also $100. Many companies are doing devices. So that's just a promo. Tell everyone. Next slide, please. Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. This was funding that went to NTIA for deployment, but also a lot of adoption, and really pretty much anything you can think of related to broadband is eligible with this funding.
attention. If you will back up the slide there, Winetta. On this list is what is titled, it's the third bullet, that is take Alaska into account when creating high cost area definitions. So there, and I will talk about this a little bit more later, there are 3 different pots of funding on the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. And one of those is a 10% set aside for high cost areas. Now, all of us sitting in this room who know Alaska know that we are automatically going to qualify as a high cost area. There's just no way we can't. But I want to read to you the definition under the BEAD program of what it is. A high cost area is an unserved area in which the cost of building out broadband service is higher as compared to the average cost of building out broadband areas in unserved areas of the United States. And the funding allocations for those high cost areas are going to be determined by factoring 1, the remote location of an area, the lack of population density in an area, unique topography, a high rate of poverty. Obviously, we satisfy all of those requirements, but then there's a 5th sort of unknown that we're trying to understand in our comments and requests for clarification from NTIA, and that's any other factor identified by the Assistant Secretary. Don't know what that is, so we're hoping that there's going to be clarification in what comes out in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Next slide, please. So the National Telecommunications and Information Administration has 4 programs that they are going to be administering under the Infrastructure Act. The first one is BEAD, Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment. The second one is the Digital Equity Act. The third one is the Middle Mile, which you also heard Christine and me talk about already. And then the tribal allocation that Christine went into some detail about. I'm going to be primarily focusing on the first 3 because the tribal monies, the initial $1 billion that was set aside in the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program under the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 has been enhanced by an additional $2 billion in the Infrastructure Act. And that money is going to be deployed directly from NTIA to the tribal entities. So the money that's going to be coming to the state will be coming under the BEAD program, under the Digital Equity Act program, and then I think to a lesser degree under Middle Mile, because as Christine already indicated, the Middle Mile money is going to become available probably in the 2nd quarter of this year. So as we are still informing our plan for deployment from around the state, Middle Mile activity is already going to be going on by the providers. Go ahead and advance the slide, Winetta. So just to reinforce, there's $42.5 billion available under BEAD nationwide, $2.75 billion available under the Digital Equity Act nationwide, and then only $1 billion under Middle Mile. And broadband, again, just to reinforce, the BEAD program is about deployment of infrastructure. The Digital Equity Act is making sure that once the infrastructure is available to people at their homes and at their place of business, that they actually have the capacity to use the internet, essentially. And finally, enabling Middle Mile is about getting broadband infrastructure between point A and point B. Go ahead and advance the slide. So here's the initial and near-term work that we are looking at under the Broadband Office. And some of this will be starting in advance because we know we won't have staff on board until the end of June, and work is going to have to continue between now and then. So under the BEAD program, each state gets $100 million of minimum allocation. Up to 5% of that, so $5 million, is available for planning money. And we expect the Notice of Funding Opportunity with the federal guidelines to be issued in mid-May. The NTIA is required to have that Notice of Funding Opportunity issued within 180 days of the passage of the Act. And since the Act was passed on November 15th, the NOFO has to be out by May 15th. Once the NOFO is issued, the state of Alaska will have to respond with what is called a Notice of Intent letter, saying that we want to participate in the program. And it sounds like a Notice of Intent letter is probably the governor just signs a letter saying, hey, we're interested, and sends it in. No, it is actually a very significant piece of work that has 6 very important components that have to be identified that go back into NTIA. Once NTIA has approved the Notice of Intent letter, then we will have access to that $5 million funding and administrative money that I mentioned just a little bit earlier. There is a caveat to that $5 million planning money, and that is we have to develop a 5-year action plan. And that 5-year action plan essentially will be the roadmap of and prioritization of how broadband infrastructure is deployed across the state. One of the things I want to reinforce at this time is what Christine talked about, which is this fabric mapping. So the fabric mapping is extremely important because it is going to inform the other funding that we have available under the BEAD program. So as you can see down here on the bottom part of the slide, there's that $100 million initial allocation. Then there is the high cost funding formula, which I talked about earlier, that's the 10% set aside. And Alaska should be very well positioned to get money under that. But then here's the big kicker, the money for unserved and underserved areas. And the definition or the formula of funding that's going to be used for determining how much money you get under underserved and unserved is based on taking the number of unserved locations in the state by the total number of unserved locations in the entire country, and then multiplying that by a quotient that is outlined in the infrastructure bill. And so the fabric mapping outlining all of the structures in the state that are available for broadband deployment and making sure that we have an accurate assessment of what broadband capacity is in those areas so that we know how many places are unserved and underserved so that that can be divided into the total number across the country is going to be hugely important. Christine and I and a number of the providers in the room participated in a meeting with the FCC's contractor. We've been spending a lot of time talking about the NTIA, but the FCC is actually the one that has the contract with an individual company to do this fabric mapping across the United States. And so we had a meeting with CostQuest, and there certainly are some concerns about the timing in which the fabric mapping and the degree of accuracy of that fabric mapping is going to be done in Alaska. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows we are working diligently with the congressional delegation, the NTIA and the FCC to make sure that the contractors' feet are held to the fire and that they're doing the appropriate mapping that they need to do. Next slide, please. So this is just an outline basically of where we are in the process. And I want to indicate to you that we haven't even started this outline yet, essentially. This outline goes through the notice of funding opportunity for BEAD, which will be in May, the letter of intent that I talked about, then the 5-year plan, and then the recommendations, the plan for deployment for Alaska. So we are well at the very beginning of this process and have a long way to go. And I just want to make sure everybody understands that. That being said, we are looking at everything as if time is of the essence, and we are leaning forward on this. We have already started working on answering the components that were outlined in the Infrastructure Act for what needs to go into the notice of intent letter so that we are well ahead of the curve when we get the notice of funding opportunity that comes out in May. So next is the Digital Equity Act. And again, the Digital Equity Act is about making sure that folks have the capacity to use the internet once broadband is deployed to their area. And that includes 3 very critical components. One is digital equity, and I'm sorry I'm reading this to you guys, but this is very clear direction that is in the Infrastructure Act. Digital equity is information technology capacity for full participation in society and the economy. Then there's digital inclusion. Digital inclusion is not only the broadband service, but devices to access the internet and applications that meet the needs of the user. And then 3, digital literacy. And those are the skills associated with using technology to enable users to find, evaluate, organize, create, and communicate information. So digital equity is it's a wholly separate but very necessary component of, I guess it's the next phase of broadband, beyond broadband is what I guess I would say. So there are 3 different funding components under the Digital Equity Act. The first is a planning grant. There's $64 million nationwide for that. And we are anticipating that Alaska is going to see a little bit over $1 million under that. Then there's a capacity grant. So once you get your planning grant money, let me back up. We expect the notice of funding opportunity for the planning grants to come out in mid-June. Once the planning grant NOFO comes out, the state will have 60 days to respond with a notice of intent letter. Again, that's separate from the notice of intent letter under BEAD. Once the notice of intent letter under the planning grant, under the Digital Equity Act is approved by NTIA, we will have 1 year to create.
It's just, we need to.
You wrap it up in 2 minutes? Okay.
Because we need to get some. Q&A.
Gotcha. I'll be quick here. Once we get our planning grant, we will have a year to get our digital equity plan passed. And I won't go into a lot of detail here. Next slide, please. So the final thing is middle mile broadband infrastructure, and Christine talked about this, so I won't go into a lot of detail. And then the other sort of the final leg to our three-legged stool for the initial and near-term work for the broadband office is going to be implementing some of the recommendations of the task force that Christine talked about. And what's on the slide, go ahead and advance the slide there, Winetta. What's on this slide is not an exhaustive list, but spinning up the statewide broadband advisory task force, making sure that we're looking at streamlined permitting, making sure that we are working on our tribal relationships and our agency relationships with Alaskans, making sure that we are developing an adequate communications plan is going to be key to this and so important. And so with that, I will wrap up since I think I am out of time, and thank everybody for listening.
Awesome.
Thanks very much, Christine and Lisa. I know we're running long and some people had to leave. I just need a little guidance from Commonwealth North. I've got about half a dozen really good questions here. Is it okay to go ahead and do these?
Yeah, I think we're
Yeah.
fine. Folks, if you can't stay, feel free to leave, but we hope you can stay with us. We have we're gonna do Q&A and we have some closing remarks and one special guest speaker. So for just like a few minutes. So yeah.
Okay, so there are some good questions here. So I think our speakers have done a good job with the details because they prompted some questions. One is thinking about the fabric map that you both talked about. So the question is, what about cabins and remote campsites? Are they part of the story here? And I'm going to let you two decide who answers.
We expect they will be anywhere where you should be able or need to get a broadband connection. And I vote strong yes for my fish camp. We expect all those locations. And one of the challenges will be, how do we identify them? You know, we can capture anywhere where there ever was a phone line. The rest is going to take some imagery and a lot more detail, but we're working on that.
Great. Next question. There's a lot of money here. And how about all of the coordination and management issues? And the specific question is, how much authority will the Office of Broadband have to make all these decisions?
I think that has yet to be determined, actually. That's not an easy question. So there is an enormous amount of money coming in. As we said earlier, we don't know the full extent of that because the information specific to high cost funding formula and the amount of unserved and underserved locations that we have has yet to be determined. But all of that money has to be turned around and deployed out to the providers who are putting that infrastructure in. And so the authority to be making these, the authority, my assumption is obviously to deploy this money will have to come from the legislature in terms of what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry. Thank you. And in terms of an appropriation bill, and we will be working with the administration will be working with the legislature to make sure that we have the appropriate amount of appropriation in place to deploy those funds. In terms of looking at how, I think part of that question is how we will determine what projects are funded and how they're prioritized. That a lot of that information will come in our 5-year plan, 5-year action plan. And then there is also this statewide broadband advisory board that is being spun up. And so how the technical determinations are made in terms of grant funds being awarded is a process that has yet to be determined, but it will be very clear and it will be communicated so that there is a fair process across the board.
Okay, and this is another one that is probably for either one of you, wondering if there's a carve out for workforce development in any of this funding?
Not that I'm aware of.
Take that back.
Take that back. We looked this up last week. There is in the DEA, digital equity.
There is the ability to spend capacity grant money and competitive grants under the Digital Equity Act on workforce development. So there hasn't been any clear decision made about that yet, but there is funding available for workforce development, which clearly is going to be an issue, not only now, but going forward as every state across the nation and the territories are going to be looking for workforce to do this deployment.
Okay, and there were two questions about technology. One about all the many miles of fiber optic cable that might have to be strung, another one about satellite. I'll just summarize those by asking, so how will these decisions ultimately be made about which technology gets deployed?
So again, I think, Christine, you're going to have to help me with the language here. There is technology neutral is the term that is being used in some of in the legislation. I think what we want to make sure happens is that the best technology that is sustainable for an area is used to be able to get the best service and allow for improvement in the future as technology or needs continue to change. And so I think there's obviously going to have to be a technical group that is looking at things in terms of deciding how those grant monies are deployed to the different providers once all the applications come in.
Okay, and just two more. One asks about renewable energy and asking if there's an effort to coordinate broadband investment with renewable energy investment in rural Alaska. Anybody know about such a provision or effort? I'll take that. Go ahead.
I know individual providers look at that and work with their options, but I'm not aware of any. I'll let Lisa answer if she knows more.
I don't have a good answer, and I think there is much yet to be discovered. I was in project management classes for a number of years related to my master's degree, and my professor called them unks, unknown unknowns. And so I still think there are a lot of unknown unknowns that we have yet to discover and figure out the answers to those. So I don't want to give you an answer to something that I don't have a clear picture of yet.
Okay, and our last question there asks if any of the plans consider a time when our state population will exceed 1 million residents. I guess that's another way to ask if future changes in population will be considered in the mapping or the number of residents that are served and so on.
Well, BEAD requires that any projects be easily upgradable or what they call scalable for capacity, more users, more speed. So I think that would address that.
Lisa?
I think the only thing I would add is if we are contemplating areas of the state where there are not yet communities, the middle mile infrastructure that goes in as part of this should help provide that infrastructure that's necessary to get the last mile in if there are new communities that none of us are contemplating right now that come to pass.
Okay, great. Well, there's been a lot of detail here. I think we had just the right speakers to explain all that detail, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them.
Very good. Thank you. Alex, thank you so much, Commissioners Sande, Christine, Lisa. We thank you for shining a light on the opportunities on our doorstep. As we move beyond the policymaking and the very considerable funding behind this policy landscape, we move quickly to how to seize those opportunities. Mike Navarre is with us today. Many of you know Mike from his long career as a state legislator, Kenai Peninsula Borough Mayor, and former state commerce commissioner and successful businessman. Mike is with us today to announce an initiative by the Rasmuson Foundation
to bridge this moment and help Alaskans realize our broadband opportunities. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm Mike Navarre. I happen to be a member of the Rasmuson Foundation board. Very fortunate to be a member of that board. And the Rasmuson Foundation began discussing broadband several years ago. We recognized the need, particularly in rural Alaska, and wanted to do something to help. We also very quickly recognized, even with the significant resources of the Rasmuson Foundation, there was no way we could build out broadband in Alaska. It's very, very expensive, given the cost in a state the size of Alaska. More recently, we've been tracking the federal legislation and the incredible amount of funding that's available. We, like many of you, recognize this as a once in a generation opportunity for Alaska to, I guess, move into the digital world and connectivity that's so important to economic activity and communication and all kinds of things that we deal with on a regular basis in order just to fully participate in the digital world. Lack of reliable broadband negatively affects many areas that the core foundation grant making, including access to healthcare, economic development, arts and culture, and education. The Rasmussen Foundation board at a recent meeting, a special meeting in February, allocated $3 million through the end of the year to support broadband grant making initiative with the effort of helping both the state and tribal entities maximize this opportunity, particularly rural and underserved communities where broadband is currently unavailable or, as importantly, unaffordable. And that will persist well into the future. Immediate areas where we identified we could help relate to the setup of state's broadband office, coordination between the state and tribes, because we have a lot of contacts there, different funding sources, and making sure that there's good coordination will I guess help make sure that we maximize the benefit that can be achieved by this opportunity. Given its central role in the broadband application process, creating a high functioning state broadband office will be critical to the state's efforts. And I want to say, I wanted to come to the meeting today to listen in, and very impressed at the work that's already been done. Commissioner Sande, I recognize the fire hose that you're drinking from right now. It's a huge job. One of the things I learned when I became commissioner is not just managing the department. You're also on the ADA board. You're also on the railroad board. You're on like 15 boards. And I thought, when do you have time actually to do the job of managing the department? So I wish you well, and feel free to call me anytime you want to vent. Christine, thank you for a very informative presentation. And Lisa, I'm very impressed at the work that's been done already with the broadband office. It's critical. And as you mentioned, time is of the essence. Secondly, the foundation is willing to consider the cost of a coordinator position in order to help assist with communication and coordination between tribes, which is a separate set of funding, and the state. We believe efficiencies can be achieved through this type of coordination. On a more targeted basis, the foundation can engage in grant making with particular emphasis on workforce development, technology training for organizations and residents, and possibly even support specific projects. For workforce development, it'll be very important for Alaska build both a workforce that can install, maintain, and service broadband infrastructure and provide training and resources to allow Alaskans, particularly those in rural Alaska, to access jobs that then can be done remotely, whether it's the maintenance jobs or whether it's other jobs that through connectivity will allow for remote participation. We're prepared to support with both efforts. The foundation also identified organizations that can provide technical assistance like engineering, regulatory support, along with grant writers to assist with applications, particularly for tribal entities. There is going to be competition for this technical expertise across the country. And so it's important that we move quickly in order to tie up some of that technical expertise. We realize this is coming together very quickly, and perhaps greater needs will emerge for existence. For instance, assistance maybe with required mapping. We're willing to help. We're open to discussions wherever we think we can help. Our primary goal is very simple. We want to help ensure that Alaska and Alaskans achieves the maximum benefit from this once in a generation opportunity. Our unique positioning, connections, and partnerships, which include tribal entities, communities, and other foundations that may provide fundings, because there will be ongoing gaps, quite frankly, even after the deployment of this incredible amount of money, we believe. So we can help with communication, collaboration, and coordination to establish a long-term strategy to best serve Alaska. We're not looking to usurp the state or the legislature or any other entity, any of the providers. All we want to do is help ensure that we maximize the benefit of this incredible opportunity for Alaska. Thank you for this opportunity and your interest in this very important opportunity and policy discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And Mike will be available after the meeting if you want to take some time and hear a little bit more. So thank you, Mike, again, for giving us the background on that initiative. We thank you and the Rasmuson Foundation for pushing forward and considering the critical steps necessary to accomplish competitive broadband grant funds and how we can supercharge our opportunity here in this state. This is a rich topic. I would suspect we will be exploring this topic in future sessions. Again, I want to thank the Alaska Communications, ConocoPhillips, Alaska, Northern Bank for supporting Commonwealth North programs. Thanks again to Dr. Alex Heels, Commissioner Julie Sande, Christine O'Connor, and Lisa Von Bargen. And we appreciate your insight and intellect on this topic. There's a lot of opportunity. To our members and audience, please watch for your inbox for announcements about April sessions, including several sessions on the Healthcare Reform Study Group and the announcement for the Alaska Assets Program later this month. Thanks to our members, our friends for joining us today. And if you are not a member yet, please, I encourage you to join us as we dive into topics that are important for public policy in the state. We are adjourned. Thank you.